Have you ever watched someone's hands and realized they're telling a story their words won't? There's this moment in Daryl Dixon Season 2 where Daryl's maintaining his crossbow, the same ritual we've seen him perform hundreds of times since Season 1. The cloth moves over the weapon in careful circles, the way it always has. But this time, when he raises it to sight down a threat, his hands shake, just slightly, just enough to notice. The crossbow, the thing that's never failed Daryl Dixon, the weapon that's been his identity for over a decade, it wavers. And I keep coming back to that moment, that tiny tremor, because I think it's telling us something Daryl would never say out loud. What if Daryl's greatest strength, his ability to survive alone, his fierce self-reliance that's kept him alive through everything, what if that's actually destroying him? What if the crossbow's not failing? What if Daryl is? Tonight, let's trace the dark truth nobody talks about. Daryl Dixon's been running from connection his entire life, and it's killing him slowly. The weapon's fine. It's the man holding it who's breaking. Settle in. This one's about survival, and the cost of forgetting how to live. Back in Season 1, when Daryl first appears in Episode 3, Tell It to the Frogs, he's hunting, alone. That's our introduction to him. A man in the woods, self-sufficient, needing no one. And when Daryl returns to camp and finds out the group left Merle handcuffed on a rooftop in Atlanta, his rage is immediate and isolating. He doesn't ask for help. He doesn't trust the group's explanation. He just wants to leave, to go back for Merle alone, because that's what Daryl knows. You survive alone. You trust no one. You rely on yourself because everyone else will let you down or die or leave. But Rick talks Daryl into staying, into going back for Merle with the group, and Daryl stays. Not because he suddenly trusts these people, but because leaving, going off alone, would make Daryl exactly like his father. And we learn through small details, through Daryl's scars and his flinches and the way he talks about growing up, that Daryl's father was absent, abusive, negligent, and Merle, for all his faults, was the only family Daryl had. And even Merle left Daryl behind constantly, chose drugs and violence and his own survival over his little brother. So, Daryl learned early, people leave, people hurt you, and if you need them, you're weak. So, Daryl became someone who doesn't need anyone. In Season 2, when Sophia goes missing, Daryl's the one who searches for her, every day, alone. He doesn't ask for company. He doesn't share his routes or strategies. Daryl just goes into the woods and searches, methodically, exhaustively, and when Daryl gets injured, thrown from a horse and impaled by his own arrow, he hallucinates Merle, mocking him, calling him weak for caring about these people, for helping them. And Daryl climbs back up that ridge anyway, pulls himself back to the farm, collapses at the group's feet, and Shane, trying to help, he calls Daryl, Merle's henchman, reduces Daryl to just an extension of his brother. And you can see in Norman Reedus' performance that it lands, that Daryl's heard that his whole life, that he's nothing without Merle, that he's just the sidekick, the follower. The emotional anchor here is that Daryl's first instinct is always flight, not fight for community. When things get hard, when connection requires vulnerability, Daryl's impulse is to leave, to go back to the woods, to be alone where it's safer, where no one can leave him because he's already left them. And the theory I'm working with is that Daryl stayed with Rick's group in those early seasons not from loyalty, but because leaving felt like repeating his father's pattern. Daryl's father abandoned him. Merle abandoned him repeatedly, and Daryl, trying desperately not to be them, he stays with the group. But staying physically doesn't mean staying emotionally. Daryl's there, but he's always at the edges, sleeping away from camp, hunting alone, existing parallel to the group rather than within it. Here's the question. Is staying with people you don't fully trust braver than leaving? Because Daryl's staying, but it's costing him. He's protecting people he won't let himself care about. He's surviving with a group but living like he's alone. And that contradiction, that performance of connection without actual connection, it's the pattern that defines Daryl's entire arc. Daryl learned to survive alone as a child, taught himself self-sufficiency as armor against abandonment. And that skill, that ability to need no one, it became his prison. Because once you've built walls that high, once you've convinced yourself connection equals weakness, you can't take the walls down even when you want to, even when you're desperate to. And Daryl, watching Sophia walk out of Herschel's barn as a walker in Season 2's pretty much dead already, he's learning that the people you search for, the people you try to save, they die anyway. And maybe, Daryl's thinking, it's better not to search at all. Merle dies in Season 3, Episode 15, This Sorrowful Life, and it breaks something in Daryl that I don't think ever fully healed. Merle sacrifices himself trying to take out the governor, and Daryl finds him reanimated, a walker, and Daryl has to put him down. And Daryl carries Merle's body out of that building, and you can see in that scene that Daryl's not just grieving his brother, he's grieving the possibility of connection, the belief that family can stay, that people you love might not leave or die or turn into monsters you have to kill. And then there's Beth. In Season 4, after the prison falls, Daryl and Beth are alone together. And Beth, young and hopeful and determined to stay human, she pushes Daryl. She makes him talk. She makes him feel. And there's this beautiful, fragile connection between them, and Daryl lets his walls down just a little. He shows Beth his scars, tells her about his childhood, admits that he's nobody without his group, and Beth tells him something that lands. "You're gonna miss me so bad when I'm gone." She says it playfully, teasing, but it's true. And then Beth's taken, kidnapped by Dawn's people at Grady Memorial Hospital, and Daryl searches for her, desperately, the same way he searched for Sophia. And in Season 5, Episode 8, Coda, Beth dies, shot in the head right in front of Daryl. And Daryl carries her body out of that hospital the same way he carried Merle. And Daryl's learning over and over the same terrible lesson. The people you let yourself care about die. The evidence is brutal. Every person Daryl connects to in these seasons dies or leaves. Merle dies. Beth dies. Carol disappears temporarily. Season 5. And the pattern The Walking Dead establishes is that Daryl's vulnerability equals people dying. It's not logical. It's not Daryl's fault. But trauma doesn't care about logic. Trauma teaches you patterns, and Daryl's pattern is, when I care, they die. When I open up, I lose them. When I let someone in, they leave me holding their body. The emotional anchor is that Daryl believes, deep down, that he kills people by caring about them, that his love is cursed, that his connection is poison. And Daryl starts to protect people by not letting himself care. He's there, he's fighting, he's protecting the group, but emotionally, he's retreating. He's building the walls higher. He's going back to what he knows. Survive alone, trust no one, need nothing. Because needing people gets them killed. Because caring makes you weak. And Daryl's been weak before, as a child with his father, as a teenager abandoned by Merle. And Daryl's decided he's never being weak again. The theory here is that Daryl learned connection equals loss, so he stopped connecting fully. After Beth's death, watch Daryl through Seasons 5 and 6. He's more isolated, more silent, more willing to take dangerous missions alone. Daryl's volunteering for the risks, putting himself in harm's way, and it's partly heroism, but it's also self-punishment. Daryl couldn't save Sophia, couldn't save Merle, couldn't save Beth, so Daryl's going to save everyone else, even if it kills him, especially if it kills him. Because Daryl doesn't think he deserves to survive when they didn't. Daryl thinks he's the one who should have died. and he's been trying, quietly, to make that right ever since. Beth told Daryl he'd changed, and he had. He'd softened, opened up, started to believe that maybe he could have something other than survival. And then Beth died, and Daryl learned that changing, being vulnerable, it doesn't protect you. It doesn't save the people you love. It just gives you more to lose. And Daryl, standing in that hospital holding Beth's body, he's making a decision. Not consciously, maybe, but emotionally, Daryl's deciding, never again. Never again will he let someone that close. Never again will he show someone his scars and believe they'll stay. Because they won't. They never do. And Daryl's going to make sure the next time someone dies, it's him, not someone he loves. Because Daryl can't carry another body. He can't survive another loss. And the only way to prevent that is to stop loving people at all. Season 7, Episode 3, The Cell, is one of the most brutal episodes in The Walking Dead. And it's brutal specifically because it's about breaking Daryl psychologically. Negan captures Daryl after the Season 6 finale, and Negan doesn't just imprison him, Negan tortures him. Strips him, puts him in a cell, plays loud music constantly to prevent sleep, feeds him dog food, sandwiches, and systematically destroys Daryl's sense of self. And Dwight, Negan's lieutenant who used to be like Daryl, he's the one administering the torture. And Dwight tells Daryl, over and over, that he can end this. All Daryl has to do is say, I'm Negan. Submit. Give up his identity. Become one of Negan's people. And Daryl almost breaks. You can see it in Norman Reedus' performance. Daryl's exhausted, traumatized, isolated. And Negan brings Daryl out, shows him the sanctuary, shows him the people who've submitted, who've said, I'm Negan, and gotten safety and food and community in return. And Negan offers Daryl the same deal. Join us. Say the words. And Daryl, barely standing, barely conscious, he refuses. Daryl says, I'm Daryl Dixon. And Negan sends him back to the cell. But here's the thing that breaks Daryl even more than the torture. Glenn's death. Because Daryl attacked Negan in the Season 7 premiere, punched him after Negan killed Abraham, and Negan's rule is clear. 1 outburst, you get a warning. 2 outbursts, someone dies. And Daryl's punch was the 2nd outburst, so Negan kills Glenn. And Negan makes sure Daryl knows it. Negan tells Daryl that Glenn's death is Daryl's fault, that if Daryl had controlled himself, Glenn would still be alive. And Daryl believes it. Daryl, already carrying guilt for Merle and Beth and everyone else he couldn't save, now he's carrying Glenn. And Glenn's death isn't distant or abstract. It's direct. Daryl's action led to Glenn's death, and Daryl watched it happen. Watched Negan beat Glenn to death with a bat while Maggie screamed. And Daryl couldn't stop it, couldn't save him, couldn't even die in Glenn's place. The evidence of Daryl's guilt is in everything he does after escaping the sanctuary. Daryl isolates even more. Daryl avoids Maggie. Can't look at her. Because how do you face the widow of the man you got killed? Daryl takes the most dangerous missions, volunteers for suicide runs, and when people try to stop him, Daryl just leaves, goes into the woods, disappears. And the pattern is clear. Daryl's punishing himself. He's not trying to be heroic. He's trying to die, because Daryl believes he deserves to die. That he should have died instead of Glenn. That his survival is an injustice that needs correcting. The emotional anchor is that Daryl believes he kills people by caring about them, and Negan confirmed it. Because Daryl cared about Glenn, considered him family, and Daryl's emotional reaction, his inability to control himself when Abraham died, got Glenn killed. And Daryl's worst fear, the thing he's been trying to avoid his whole life, it came true. Loving people gets them killed. And Daryl's love for Glenn, his instinct to protect, to act, it backfired catastrophically. And Daryl's learning, That it's not just that people he loves die, it's that Daryl kills them. Not intentionally, but the result is the same. And Daryl, carrying that guilt, he's convinced that the safest thing he can do for everyone he loves is to stay away from them. The theory is that Negan didn't break Daryl's body, though he tried. Negan confirmed Daryl's worst belief about himself, that Daryl's poison to the people he loves. That Daryl's presence, his caring, his inability to control his emotions, it gets people killed. And Daryl left Negan's cell, but he never stopped being a prisoner of that belief. Because you can escape a physical prison, you can't escape the prison of guilt. And Daryl's guilt about Glenn, added to his guilt about Merle and Beth and everyone else, it's crushing him. And Daryl's response isn't to seek comfort or therapy or connection. Daryl's response is isolation, is self-punishment, is making sure that the next time someone dies, it's him. Because Daryl can't carry another name, another face, another body he couldn't save. Here's the question for you. If you believed that loving people got them killed, would you stop loving? Would you isolate yourself, convince yourself it's for their protection? Or would you fight that belief, try to connect anyway? Because Daryl chose isolation, and maybe, in his mind, that's the most loving thing he can do. Stay away. Keep people safe by keeping them at a distance. Let them live by not letting them matter. And Daryl, walking away from the group again and again in seasons 7 and 8, he's trying to save them. He just doesn't realize he's destroying himself to do it. And maybe Daryl's okay with that. Maybe Daryl thinks destroying himself is a fair trade for keeping everyone else alive. And that belief, that calculus, it's the poison. Not Daryl, the belief that he has to choose between his survival and theirs. And Daryl's choosing theirs every time, without realizing that eventually there won't be anything left of him to give. Rick's death, or what everyone believes is Rick's death in Season 9, Episode 5, it changes Daryl completely. Rick's been Daryl's anchor since Season 1. Rick's the person who convinced Daryl to stay with the group, who saw something in Daryl beyond the angry redneck everyone else dismissed. Rick trusted Daryl, made Daryl his right hand, his brother. And when Rick sacrifices himself on that bridge, when Daryl watches the explosion and thinks Rick's gone, Daryl breaks in a way we haven't seen before. After Rick's death, Daryl doesn't stay in Alexandria. He doesn't grieve with Carol or Michonne or the group. Daryl leaves, goes deep into the woods, lives alone for years. And we see this in Season 9's time jump and into Season 10. Daryl's isolated himself completely, living in a makeshift camp, tracking, hunting, existing but not living. And Carol finds him in Season 10, tries to bring him back. And there's this beautiful, painful scene where Carol asks Daryl, "You gonna hide out here forever?" And Daryl doesn't have a good answer. He just shrugs, says something about looking for Rick's body, about making sure. But Carol knows, and we know, that Daryl's not out there looking for Rick. Daryl's out there hiding from grief. The theory here is that Daryl chose isolation after Rick died because he couldn't handle another loss, because Rick was supposed to be the one who stayed. Rick was the leader, the constant, the person Daryl trusted more than anyone, and Rick died, saving everyone, and Daryl couldn't stop it, couldn't help, couldn't even say goodbye. And Daryl's grief is too big to process in community. So Daryl goes where he's always gone when things hurt too much. The woods, alone, where no one can see him break, where no one needs him to be strong, where Daryl can just exist without performing okayness for people who need him to be okay. The emotional weight is that Daryl loved Rick like a brother, maybe more than he loved Merle, and he couldn't grieve Rick in community because community required Daryl to keep functioning. Alexandria needed leaders. Judith and RJ needed protecting. Michonne needed support, and Daryl couldn't be those things because Daryl was drowning. So Daryl left, and the leaving felt like survival, felt like the only choice. But really, Daryl was repeating his pattern. When connection costs too much, when grief is too heavy, leave. Go where it's safe. Be alone where loss can't find you because there's nothing left to lose. Carol bringing Daryl back from the woods. It's an act of love. Carol knows Daryl's pattern. Carol knows that Daryl will disappear forever if someone doesn't pull him back. And Carol goes into those woods and sits with Daryl and doesn't ask him to explain or defend or justify. Carol just sits. And eventually, Daryl comes back. Not fully, not healed, but enough to function. Enough to keep going. And the pattern The Walking Dead establishes is that every time Daryl loses someone, he runs further from people. Lost Merle ran to Beth. Lost Beth ran deeper into the group's missions. Lost Rick ran to the woods. And each time, Daryl's running further, staying longer, coming back less whole. The thing is, Carol brought Daryl back from the woods physically, but part of Daryl never left. Part of Daryl's still out there, alone, grieving Rick, convinced that if he'd been faster, smarter, better, Rick would still be alive. And that guilt, layered on top of Glenn's guilt, layered on top of Beth's and Merle's and everyone else's, it's too much. Daryl's carrying so many dead that he can barely stand upright. And Daryl's response isn't to share the weight. It's to carry it alone, in silence, in isolation, because asking for help means admitting he needs people, and needing people means they can leave, and Daryl's done losing people. So Daryl keeps them at a distance, even the ones like Carol who'd walk into the woods for him, who'd sit with him in his grief. Even Carol, Daryl won't fully let in. Because Daryl's learned that everyone leaves eventually. Merle left, Beth left, Rick left, and Daryl's going to make sure the next time someone leaves, it doesn't hurt, because Daryl won't have let them close enough to matter, even though they already do. Even though Daryl's already lost, he just won't admit it. In Season 10's bonus episodes, specifically Find Me, we learn about Leah. Daryl, during his years alone in the woods after Rick's death, he met a woman. Leah's living in a cabin, isolated like Daryl, and she's lost people too. Her son, her group. And Daryl and Leah, they form a relationship. It's tentative, built on shared silence and shared survival, and for a while it seems like maybe Daryl's found something. Someone who understands isolation, who won't ask him to be more than he is, who's okay with the walls Daryl's built because she's built the same ones. But then Leah disappears, leaves a note saying she's found her people, found her family, and she needs to be with them. And Daryl's left alone again in that cabin, holding a note that says essentially, you weren't enough. And when Leah reappears in Season 11, she's with the Reapers, a militaristic group that's hostile to Daryl's people. And Leah and Daryl are on opposite sides. And there's this heartbreaking moment where Leah tells Daryl something like, I chose my family. Why can't you understand that? And Daryl does understand. He understands completely. Because Daryl's whole life has been about people choosing their family over him. Merle chose drugs. His father chose absence. And now Leah's chosen the Reapers. And Daryl's left. Again, with the confirmation that he's not enough. That people will always choose something or someone else over him. The evidence is in how Daryl talks about Leah, the few times he mentions her. There's no anger, just resignation. Daryl tells Carol something to the effect of, people I love, they leave, or they die. And that's Daryl's worldview, condensed. That's the belief that's guiding every choice Daryl makes. Love equals loss. Connection equals abandonment. And Daryl's trying to protect himself by not loving, by not connecting. But he's failing, because Daryl does love people. He loves Carol and Judith and his found family. He just won't let himself need them. Won't let himself believe they'll stay, because history tells him they won't. The emotional anchor is that Daryl tried to love someone, picked someone as isolated as him, and it still didn't work, because Leah wasn't the problem. Daryl's belief system is the problem. Daryl's convinced that he's unlovable, that he's not enough, that people will always leave. And Leah leaving confirmed that. And Leah's betrayal, joining the Reapers and fighting against Daryl's people, it's just more proof that Daryl's love is cursed, that when Daryl cares about someone, they either die or betray him. And either way, Daryl loses. And Daryl's learning to stop caring as a defensive mechanism, as armor, because if you don't care, you can't get hurt. Except Daryl does care. He just pretends he doesn't. And that pretending, that performance of indifference, it's destroying him. The theory is that Leah wasn't love. Leah was Daryl testing if he could have a normal life, and failing and confirming he can't. Because Daryl and Leah's relationship was built on shared loneliness, not on actual connection. They were two isolated people existing near each other, and that's not love, that's parallel survival. Real love requires vulnerability, trust, belief that the other person will stay. And Daryl couldn't give that to Leah because Daryl doesn't believe anyone will stay. And Leah couldn't give it to Daryl because she had her own trauma, her own losses. So they circled each other, and it felt like something, but it wasn't. And when Leah's real family called, she left. And Daryl, he wasn't surprised. He was just confirmed in his belief that everyone leaves eventually. And Daryl's response isn't to try again, to find someone else, to believe that maybe next time will be different. Daryl's response is, there won't be a next time. Daryl's done trying. He's going to focus on what he's good at surviving, protecting, existing at the edges of other people's lives, without ever fully stepping into his own. Here's the question. Can you build real love on shared trauma, or just shared survival? Because Daryl and Leah survived together, but they didn't love each other in a way that healed or sustained. They just reminded each other that they were damaged, and damaged people can exist together without ever actually connecting. And Daryl lost Leah the same way he lost everyone, by being himself. By being someone who's convinced he's not enough, not worthy, not capable of being loved. And until Daryl confronts that belief, until Daryl realizes that he's lovable, not despite his damage, but including it, Daryl's going to keep losing people. Not because they leave, but because Daryl never fully lets them in. And you can't lose someone who was never really yours. And Leah, walking away from that cabin, she was never really Daryl's, because Daryl never really let her be. The Commonwealth arc in Season 11 is fascinating for Daryl, because it forces him into a role he's never fit, civilized citizen. The Commonwealth is a large, organized community, with a functioning government, jobs, currency, social classes. It's pre-apocalypse society rebuilt, and Daryl, he integrates initially because the group needs him to, because Judith and RJ and everyone are there, and Daryl's not going to leave them. But Daryl's deeply uncomfortable. He's given a Commonwealth military uniform, assigned to guard duty or patrols, and you can see in every scene that Daryl's wearing that uniform like it's a costume, like he's playing a role that doesn't fit. There's something deeply sad about watching Daryl try to integrate into civilization. He's attending Commonwealth events, standing in formation, following orders from people he doesn't respect, and Daryl's good at following orders when he trusts the person giving them. He followed Rick without question, but Commonwealth leadership, Pamela Milton and her administration, Daryl doesn't trust them. He sees the corruption, the inequality, the way the Commonwealth exploits lower classes, and Daryl can't pretend he doesn't see it. So Daryl takes dangerous missions outside the walls, volunteers for anything that gets him out of the Commonwealth and back into survival mode. Because survival mode is what Daryl knows. Survival mode doesn't require small talk, or socialization, or pretending to be someone he's not. The theory here is that Daryl can't integrate because he's forgotten how to be a person. He only knows how to be a survivor. Because for over a decade, Daryl's identity has been track, hunt, protect, survive. Daryl's utility-based. He's valuable because he's skilled, not because he's personable. And the Commonwealth requires personhood. It requires socializing, building relationships beyond utility, existing in a community not as a weapon but as a citizen. And Daryl doesn't know how to do that. Daryl's spent so long being the guy who goes into danger alone that he doesn't know how to be the guy who goes to community dinners. And the Commonwealth, for all its problems, it's offering Daryl a chance at a normal life, a house, a job, safety, and Daryl can't accept it. Because accepting it means admitting that maybe the apocalypse is over, that maybe he doesn't have to be in survival mode forever. And Daryl doesn't know who he is if he's not surviving. The emotional anchor is that peacetime is Daryl's nightmare. Because peacetime means processing trauma. Peacetime means sitting with grief, with guilt, with all the losses Daryl's been outrunning for years. And Daryl can't do that. Daryl needs missions, needs danger, needs something to fight, because fighting is easier than feeling. And the Commonwealth, offering Daryl safety, is actually offering Daryl the most dangerous thing imaginable, time and space to confront himself. And Daryl's not ready for that. Maybe Daryl will never be ready for that. The pattern The Walking Dead establishes is that survivors struggle more with peace than war. Because war is clear. War has sides, enemies, objectives. Peace is ambiguous. Peace requires healing, and healing requires vulnerability. And vulnerability is what Daryl spent his entire life avoiding. So Daryl, in the Commonwealth, he's more isolated than he was in the apocalypse. Because at least in the apocalypse, Daryl's skills made him valuable, made him necessary. In the Commonwealth, Daryl's just another soldier, replaceable. And Daryl's value, his entire sense of self, it's built on being irreplaceable. Being the tracker no one else can match, the survivor no one else can outlast. And the Commonwealth doesn't need that version of Daryl. They need Citizen Daryl. And Citizen Daryl doesn't exist. The truth is, the Commonwealth offered Daryl safety, but safety meant facing what survival cost him. It meant looking at the man he's become and asking if that's who he wants to be. It meant considering a future beyond just not dying, and Daryl couldn't do it. So Daryl kept volunteering for missions outside the walls, kept choosing danger over safety, kept being the survivor even when the world didn't need survivors anymore. And that choice, to stay in survival mode when peace is possible, it tells you everything about how broken Daryl is. Because Daryl's not surviving to live, he's surviving to avoid living. And the Commonwealth, bless them, they couldn't give Daryl what he needed, because what Daryl needed was permission to stop, permission to rest, permission to be broken and still be worthy. And no one can give you that. You have to give it to yourself. And Daryl, standing in that Commonwealth uniform, he wasn't ready. He's still not ready. And maybe, watching him struggle, we're starting to realize he might never be. Daryl Dixon. Season 1 opens with Daryl washing ashore in France, separated from everything and everyone he knows. It's the result of an accident, a ship malfunction or attack, and Daryl's stranded in a foreign country with no way home. And Daryl's first words in the series, his immediate priority, it's, I need to get home. Home to Judith, home to RJ, home to Carol and the community he's built. And that desperation, that single-minded focus on returning, it's new for Daryl, because Daryl's spent decades running away from people, and now, finally, he's desperate to get back to them. The irony is brutal. Daryl spent his whole life running from connection, isolating himself, choosing solitude over vulnerability. And now, when Daryl's finally ready to stay, ready to be part of his found family without running, fate separates him from them. Daryl's greatest fear, the fear that's driven every choice he's made, is isolation from the people he loves. And now that fear's literal. Daryl's alone, in a country where he doesn't speak the language, surrounded by people who don't know him, and the family he's finally admitted he needs is an ocean away. The theory here is that Daryl's forced separation from his found family is the universe confronting him with what he's been doing to himself for years. Because Daryl's been emotionally isolated from his family, even when he's physically present. Daryl's been holding Carol and Judith and everyone at arm's length, protecting them by not letting them fully in. And now Daryl's experiencing what that emotional distance feels like as physical distance. And it's unbearable. And maybe, just maybe, Daryl's learning that the isolation he's imposed on himself, the walls he's built, they're just as painful as being literally separated. And Daryl's been causing himself this pain for years without realizing it. The emotional weight is that Daryl finally had family and lost them through accident, not choice. Because all of Daryl's previous losses, they were someone's choice. Merle chose drugs over Daryl. Beth was taken. Leah chose the Reapers. But Judith and RJ and Carol, they didn't choose to lose Daryl. Daryl didn't choose to leave them. It just happened. And that randomness, that lack of blame, it's almost harder for Daryl. Because Daryl's used to loss being someone's fault, being connected to a choice or failure. But this loss is just random, meaningless. And Daryl's searching for meaning, searching for how to fix it, how to get back, and there's no clear answer. Just the ocean and the distance, and Daryl's desperation to return to people he's finally admitted he loves. The evidence is in Daryl's behavior throughout Daryl Dixon Season 1. Every choice Daryl makes is aimed at getting home. He's not exploring France or settling in or considering staying. Daryl's focused, mission-oriented, desperate. And it's the first time we've seen Daryl this focused on returning to people rather than running from them. And that shift, that reversal, it's character growth. It's Daryl finally admitting that he needs his found family, that isolation isn't strength, that connection isn't weakness. But Daryl's learning this lesson while separated from the people he's learning it about. And that's the tragedy. Here's the question for you. Is being forced away different from choosing to leave? Because Daryl spent decades choosing to leave, choosing isolation, choosing distance. And now Daryl's forced away, and he hates it, and he's fighting to get back. And the difference between choosing isolation and having isolation imposed on you, it's the difference between control and powerlessness. Daryl chose to be alone because being alone felt safe, felt like he was protecting himself and others. But being forced to be alone, having connection taken from him, it's showing Daryl what he's been doing to himself all along. He's been taking connection from himself, imposing isolation, and calling it protection. But it's not protection, it's punishment. And Daryl, washed up on that French shore, desperate to get home, he's finally feeling what he's been inflicting on himself for years. And it's unbearable. And maybe that's what it takes. Maybe Daryl needed to be forced away from his family to realize how much he needs them, how much he's been hurting himself by keeping them at a distance. And maybe, if Daryl makes it home, he'll finally let them in. Finally let himself be loved. Finally believe that he's worth staying for. Laurent is introduced in Daryl Dixon, Season 1, as a child who might be immune to walker bites, or at least has some unique connection to the infection. And Daryl's tasked with protecting Laurent, getting him to safety, keeping him alive, and watching Daryl with Laurent. there's something achingly familiar. Daryl's gentle with Laurent, patient, teaching him survival skills, but also just being present. And Daryl tells Laurent at one point, "You remind me of someone." And we know who. Carl, Judith. The kids, Daryl's, protected over the years. The surrogate children who've given Daryl purpose when he couldn't find it in himself. The theory is that Laurent is Daryl's chance to save the child he couldn't save. Because Daryl's been carrying guilt about Sophia since season 2. He searched for her, tried so hard to find her, and she was dead the whole time. And Daryl's protected Carl and Judith, but he wasn't their parent, wasn't their primary protector. And Daryl's always been adjacent to fatherhood, close enough to feel it but never fully stepping into the role. And Laurent, this child who needs Daryl specifically, who trusts Daryl, who's learning from Daryl, he's giving Daryl a chance at redemption, a chance to be the protector Daryl's always tried to be but felt like he kept failing at. The emotional anchor is that Daryl's finally letting himself care despite his history of loss. Because Laurent's vulnerable. Laurent could die, could be taken, could disappear like Beth and Sophia and everyone else. And Daryl's caring anyway. Daryl's teaching Laurent to use a crossbow, telling him stories, letting Laurent see parts of Daryl that Daryl usually keeps hidden. And that vulnerability, that willingness to care even knowing it might end in loss, it's growth. It's Daryl choosing connection over self-protection, and it's terrifying for him. The pattern The Walking Dead establishes is that characters are given children to protect as redemption arcs. Rick had Carl and Judith, Carol had Sophia, then Lizzie and Mika, then Henry. Michonne had Andre, then Carl and Judith, and now Daryl has Laurent. And these children, they force adult characters to be better, to choose hope, to fight for a future beyond their own survival. And Laurent's doing that for Daryl. Laurent's making Daryl believe that maybe the future matters, that maybe protecting this child is worth the risk of loss, that maybe Daryl's capable of being more than just a survivor. But there's also the fear, the question that haunts every scene between Daryl and Laurent. Will Laurent be the first person Daryl protects who doesn't die for it? Or will he be another name on Daryl's list of losses, another child Daryl couldn't save? Because Daryl's pattern is clear. The people Daryl loves die. And Laurent, vulnerable and young and trusting Daryl completely, he's at risk, and Daryl knows it. And Daryl's protecting Laurent anyway, choosing to care anyway, because maybe Daryl's learning that the risk of loss doesn't justify refusing to love, that isolation doesn't protect you from grief. It just makes you grieve alone. The truth is, Laurent might be the first person Daryl protects who doesn't die for it, but he also might not be. And Daryl's living in that uncertainty, in that space between hope and fear, and he's choosing to care anyway. And that's brave. That's growth. That's Daryl finally learning that love doesn't equal loss, even though his experience tells him it does. Love equals connection. And connection, even temporary connection, even connection that might end in grief, it's better than isolation. It's better than the slow death of never letting anyone in. And Daryl, teaching Laurent how to track, how to survive, how to hope, he's teaching himself too. He's learning that maybe he's not poison. Maybe the people he loves don't die because he loves them. Maybe they just die because the world is dangerous and random and cruel. And maybe Daryl's love, his protection, his care, maybe it gives them something beautiful before the end. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that has to be enough. Isabel appears in Daryl Dixon, Season 1, as a nun who's protecting Laurent, and there's an immediate connection between her and Daryl. Not romantic necessarily, at least not initially, but a recognition. Isabel's lost people too. She's made hard choices. She's been broken by the apocalypse and put herself back together into something functional but fragile. And Isabel sees Daryl clearly, sees the isolation and the guilt and the pain he's carrying, and she doesn't try to fix him. She just accepts him. And there's something powerful in that. Someone seeing all of Daryl, all of his damage and his walls and his scars, and choosing to stay anyway. And Isabel tells Daryl, at some point in season 1 or 2, something like, maybe you're supposed to be here, not in America, not going home, here, in France, protecting Laurent, being part of this new community. And that's the choice Daryl's facing. Stay in France, where Daryl's found purpose and connection and people who need him. Or return to America, to the family Daryl's built over decades, to Judith and Carol and everyone waiting for him. And either choice means loss. If Daryl stays, he loses his found family in America. If Daryl leaves, he loses Laurent and Isabel and the community he's built in France. And Daryl's trapped between two families, and choosing one means abandoning the other. The theory is that Isabel represents Daryl's choice: stay in France and run from his past, or return to America and face his found family. Because staying in France is safe. It's starting over. It's being someone new, someone without decades of accumulated grief and guilt. In France, Daryl's not the guy who couldn't save Beth or Glenn or Rick. In France, Daryl's just Daryl, protector of Laurent, member of this new community. And that anonymity, that fresh start, it's tempting. It's offering Daryl an escape from himself, from his history, from the weight he's been carrying. But returning to America means facing everyone. Facing Carol, who knows Daryl better than anyone, and will see immediately that Daryl's changed, that France did something to him. Facing Judith and RJ, who've been waiting for Daryl, who need him. Facing the community that's built its survival partially on Daryl's skills and presence. And that accountability, that connection, it's heavy. It's responsibility. And Daryl's been running from responsibility his whole life, even while performing it. Because you can protect people while keeping them at emotional distance. But going home means closing that distance. It means admitting Daryl needs them as much as they need him. And that admission, that vulnerability, it terrifies Daryl. The emotional weight is that Daryl's being offered new family or return to found family, and choosing means loss either way. And there's no right answer. Laurent needs Daryl. Isabel needs Daryl. But Judith and Carol and everyone in America, they need Daryl too. And Daryl's one person, capable of so much, but not capable of being in two places at once, of protecting two families simultaneously. And Daryl's learning that choosing means loss, that you can't have everything, that every choice costs something. And Daryl's been trying his whole life not to choose, to keep options open, to stay emotionally available, to leave so he's never fully committed. But France is forcing Daryl to choose, stay or go, new family or old family, future or past. And whichever Daryl chooses, he'll spend the rest of his life wondering if he chose wrong. Here's the question. If starting over meant never facing your past, would you? Because that's what France is offering Daryl. A fresh start. No history. No guilt. Just Daryl and Laurent and Isabel and this new community. And Daryl could stay. He could choose that. He could let America and everyone there become his past, become memory instead of present. And part of Daryl wants that. Part of Daryl is exhausted by the weight of his history, by the decades of loss and survival and barely holding on. But another part of Daryl knows that running from your past doesn't erase it. It just makes you carry it alone. And Daryl's been carrying his past alone his whole life. And maybe, just maybe, Daryl's learning that going home, facing Carol and Judith and everyone, admitting he needs them, that's not weakness. That's strength. That's choosing connection over escape. That's choosing to be seen, fully seen, scars and damage and all, by people who love him anyway. And that's the scariest choice Daryl's ever faced. Scarier than Walker's. Scarier than Negan. Scarier than anything. Because this time, if Daryl chooses wrong, If he chooses to leave and they reject him, or if he chooses to stay and regrets it, there's no do-over. There's just the choice and the living with it. There's a moment in Daryl Dixon Season 2. I don't have the exact episode, but there's a scene where Daryl raises his crossbow to shoot a threat and his hands shake. Not from fear, from something deeper, from exhaustion, from trauma, from the weight of over a decade of survival finally catching up to him. And Daryl lowers the crossbow, resets, raises it again, and his hands still shake. And the crossbow, the weapon that's been Daryl's identity, his constant, the thing that's never failed him, it wavers. The theory is that Daryl's losing his survival edge because he's finally processing decades of trauma. Because Daryl's kept himself in survival mode for so long that his body and mind haven't had time to process anything. He's just been reacting, surviving, moving forward. And now, in France, separated from his family and forced into this liminal space between two worlds, Daryl's body is finally saying, enough. We can't keep doing this. We can't keep being the weapon, the protector, the survivor who never breaks. Because Daryl is breaking. Has been breaking for years. He just hasn't let himself feel it. The evidence is in the crossbow maintenance ritual. Daryl's been maintaining his crossbow the same way since Season 1. It's meditative, calming, a routine that grounds him. And the ritual continues in France. Daryl cleans the crossbow, checks the string, inspects the bolts. But the execution, the actual use of the weapon, it's faltering. And that disconnect between the ritual and the reality, it's Daryl's body betraying what his mind won't admit. That he's not okay, that he hasn't been okay for years, that survival isn't the same as living, and Daryl's been surviving without living for so long that he's forgotten what living feels like. The emotional anchor is that Daryl's weapon was his identity, and what happens when he can't be the weapon anymore. Because Daryl's value, his sense of self, it's built on being useful, being the tracker, the hunter, the protector. And if Daryl can't do those things, if his hands shake and his aim falters and the crossbow fails, then who is Daryl? What's his purpose? Why would anyone need him, want him, choose to keep him around if he's not useful anymore? The pattern The Walking Dead establishes is that warriors break down when they try to be human. Because being a warrior is simple. You fight, you protect, you survive. But being human is complicated. It requires processing emotions, confronting trauma, admitting vulnerability. And Daryl spent so long being a warrior that he's forgotten how to be human. And his body, his hands shaking on the crossbow, they're forcing the issue. They're saying, you can't be the weapon forever. Eventually, you have to be the person. And the person is broken. And the person needs help. And admitting that, accepting that, it's harder than anything Daryl's ever done. The crossbow that never failed Daryl is failing because Daryl's changing. Because Daryl's finally, after decades, letting himself feel, letting himself grieve, letting himself admit that he's not okay, that he needs help, that he can't do this alone anymore. And that admission, that acceptance, it's manifesting physically. The weapon shakes because the man holding it is shaking. The aim falters because Daryl's foundation, his sense of self, it's crumbling, and Daryl's at a crossroads. He can double down, force himself back into warrior mode, suppress the emotions and the trauma and keep going. Or he can let the weapon fall, let himself break, let himself be helped. And that second option, it terrifies Daryl. Because Daryl doesn't know who he is if he's not the weapon. Daryl doesn't know if anyone will love him if he's not useful. And Daryl's about to find out, whether he wants to or not. Let's talk about what Daryl's lost. Not the people, we've covered that, but what survival has cost Daryl personally. Because Daryl's kept everyone alive, or tried to, for over a decade. And in doing so, Daryl's lost the ability to live, not just survive. Daryl doesn't know how to be at peace, doesn't know how to accept safety, doesn't know how to build relationships based on anything other than utility. And that's a devastating loss. Because Daryl survived, yes, but he's also died, slowly, piece by piece, losing parts of himself every time he chose survival over humanity. Think about Daryl's relationships. Carol's the closest thing Daryl has to a best friend. And their relationship is beautiful, but it's also built on shared trauma and survival. They protect each other, save each other, but they don't talk about feelings. They don't process grief together. They just exist in parallel, two broken people who understand each other's brokenness without having to explain it. And that's valuable, but it's not healing. It's just shared survival. And Judith and RJ, Daryl loves them. But Daryl's relationship with them is protector and protected. Daryl teaches them survival skills, keeps them safe, but Daryl doesn't let them see his vulnerability. Daryl doesn't let them help him. Because Daryl's the adult, the protector, and asking children for help, admitting to them that you're broken, it feels wrong. So Daryl performs strength for them, and they see strong Daryl, protector Daryl, but they don't see broken Daryl, grieving Daryl, the man who's barely holding it together. The theory is that Daryl's survival skills cost him the ability to live. Because Daryl's so good at surviving, so practiced at it, that he can't imagine doing anything else. And living, actual living, it requires vulnerability, intimacy, connection beyond utility. And Daryl doesn't have that. Daryl can save people, but he can't let them save him. Daryl can protect people, but he can't let them protect him. And that imbalance, that one-way relationship dynamic, it's sustainable short-term, but it's destroying Daryl long-term. Because eventually, you need someone to save you. Eventually, you need to be protected, and Daryl won't let anyone do that for him. So Daryl just keeps giving, keeps protecting, keeps surviving, and there's nothing coming back. No one's filling Daryl's cup, and Daryl's running empty. The evidence is in every relationship Daryl has. They're all built on utility. Carol needs Daryl to be her anchor. Judith and RJ need Daryl to be their protector. Laurent needs Daryl to keep him safe. And Daryl performs those roles perfectly. But what does Daryl need? Who's meeting Daryl's needs? And Daryl would probably say he doesn't have needs, that he's fine, that he just needs to keep everyone else safe. But that's a lie. Daryl needs to be seen, to be valued for more than his skills, to be loved not for what he does, but for who he is. And Daryl doesn't have that. And Daryl's too afraid to ask for it. Because asking means admitting need. And admitting need means admitting vulnerability. And vulnerability, Daryl learned as a child, gets you hurt. The emotional anchor is that Daryl can save people, but he can't let them save him. And that's the tragedy. That's the dark truth. Daryl's surrounded by people who love him, who'd do anything for him, and Daryl won't let them. Won't let them see his pain, won't let them carry his grief, won't let them help. Because Daryl's convinced that his pain is his to carry, that asking for help is weakness, that being saved makes you obligated, and Daryl doesn't want to be obligated. Daryl doesn't want to owe anyone, so Daryl just keeps saving people and refusing to be saved. And it's killing him. Slowly, quietly, but it's killing him. And the people who love him, they can see it. They just don't know how to help someone who won't let himself be helped. And Daryl, carrying the weight of everyone's survival on his shoulders, he's learning that strength isn't refusing help. Strength is accepting it. But that's a lesson Daryl's not ready to learn. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Here's the dark truth about Daryl Dixon, the thing I don't think we're supposed to say out loud. Daryl doesn't want to survive. He just doesn't know how to stop. Because survival's what Daryl knows. It's what he's good at. It's the only thing that's made him valuable, made him matter. And Daryl's been surviving for so long that it's become automatic, reflexive. But surviving isn't the same as wanting to survive. And I think Daryl stopped wanting to survive years ago. Around the time Beth died, maybe, or Glenn, or Rick. At some point, Daryl stopped fighting to live and started just continuing. Because stopping means giving up. And giving up means everyone he's lost died for nothing. So Daryl keeps going, keeps surviving. Not because he wants to, but because he doesn't know what else to do. The evidence is in Daryl's pattern of behavior. The reckless missions, the volunteering for the most dangerous assignments. The way Daryl puts himself in harm's way without hesitation, without self-preservation. Some people call it heroism, but I think it's something darker. I think it's Daryl testing fate, seeing if maybe this time, this mission, this fight, maybe he'll finally get to stop. And every time Daryl survives, it's almost disappointing. Because Daryl's too skilled to die accidentally. Daryl's too good at survival to just stumble into death. So Daryl keeps living, keeps surviving, even though part of him stopped wanting to years ago. And here's the really dark part. What if Daryl's been passively suicidal for years, but too skilled to die? What if every dangerous mission, every reckless choice, it's Daryl's way of trying to stop without actually choosing to stop? Because choosing to stop, choosing to give up, that's quitting. And Daryl's not a quitter. But putting himself in situations where death is likely, where survival is improbable, and then surviving anyway because he's just that good, that's not quitting. That's just bad luck. And Daryl can live with bad luck. He can't live with being a quitter. The emotional weight of this theory is staggering. Because if Daryl doesn't want to survive, if Daryl's just continuing out of habit and obligation, then what's the point? What's Daryl living for? And the answer, I think, is other people. Daryl's living for Judith, for Carol, for Laurent, for everyone who needs him. Daryl's survival isn't for himself, it's for them. And that's simultaneously beautiful and heartbreaking. Beautiful because Daryl's putting others first, sacrificing his own peace for their safety. Heartbreaking because Daryl doesn't think his own life has value beyond his utility to others. The counter theory, and it's important to consider, is that maybe Daryl's survival is his purpose, and peace would make him purposeless. Because what would Daryl do if the world became safe? If there were no more threats, no more missions, no more people who needed protecting? Daryl's entire identity is built on being needed in crisis. And if the crisis ended, Daryl would have to find a new identity. And Daryl doesn't know who he is beyond survivor, protector, warrior. So maybe Daryl's resistance to peace, his discomfort in the Commonwealth, his inability to integrate into civilization, maybe it's not just trauma. Maybe it's fear that, without crisis, Daryl has no purpose. And without purpose, Daryl has no reason to exist. Here's the question I want you to sit with. Is surviving without living still surviving? Because Daryl's alive. His heart beats. He breathes. He eats and sleeps and continues. But is that life? Or is that just biological persistence? Because life, actual life, it includes joy and hope and connection and moments where you're glad to be alive. And I don't think Daryl's had many of those moments in recent years. I think Daryl's been in survival mode for so long that he's forgotten what it feels like to actually live. And that forgetting, that loss of joy, it's a death. It's just a slow death, a death by inches. And Daryl's been dying this way for years. The dark truth is, Daryl's been dying slowly since season 1, just taking decades to finish. And France, Laurent, Isabelle, maybe they're Daryl's chance to start living again. Or maybe they're just more reasons to keep surviving without living. And we won't know until Daryl makes a choice. Until Daryl decides whether he wants to live or just wants to keep not dying. And that choice, that decision, it's the scariest one Daryl's ever faced. Because it requires admitting that survival isn't enough, that you deserve more than just continuing, that your life has value beyond your utility. And Daryl, after decades of believing otherwise, he's not sure that's true, but maybe, just maybe, he's ready to find out. So where does Daryl go from here? That's the question hovering over everything. Daryl's in France, caught between Laurent and Isabelle on one side and his American family on the other. And Daryl's at a crossroads, a genuine crossroads, where the choice he makes will define who he becomes. Stay in France, embrace this new family, let himself start over, or return to America, face his found family, admit he needs them, choose connection over escape. And here's my theory. Daryl's at a point where either choice means loss, but both choices mean growth. If Daryl stays in France, he loses Judith and Carol, and everyone who's been waiting for him. But Daryl also gets to build something new, something not weighed down by decades of trauma and loss. Daryl gets to be someone other than the guy who couldn't save Beth or Glenn. Daryl gets a fresh start, and there's value in that. There's healing in being seen by people who don't know your history, who just see you as you are now. But if Daryl returns to America, Daryl loses Laurent and Isabelle and this new community he's built. But Daryl also gets to close the circle, to return to the people who love him, to admit that he needs them as much as they need him. And there's healing in that, too. There's growth in choosing connection over fear, in facing your past instead of running from it, in being vulnerable with people who've earned your trust. The evidence that Daryl's conflicted is visible in Daryl Dixon Season 2. Daryl's building connections in France, letting himself care about Laurent and Isabelle, but Daryl's also constantly talking about going home, about getting back to America. And that conflict, that inability to fully commit to either place, it's Daryl's pattern. Daryl spent his whole life with one foot out the door, ready to leave, maintaining emotional distance even when he's physically present. And France is forcing Daryl to choose, stay or go, commit or leave. And whichever Daryl chooses, he has to choose fully. He can't keep one foot in each world. The emotional anchor is that Daryl's identity is in crisis, because for decades, Daryl's been the survivor, the protector, the guy who exists at the edges of community without ever fully joining. And that worked when Daryl was protecting himself from loss. But now Daryl's facing a choice that requires full commitment. And full commitment means vulnerability, means admitting you're choosing something, someone, and that choice could end in loss, but you're choosing it anyway. And Daryl's terrified, because choosing means caring. And caring means potential loss. And loss is what Daryl's been running from his entire life. The pattern The Walking Dead establishes is that survivors must choose between past and future, and they rarely get both. Rick chose future building, Alexandria, uniting communities, and lost his past, separated from his family by the CRM. Michonne chose past, searching for Rick, and risked her future, leaving Judith and RJ. And now Daryl's facing the same choice. Past return to America, to the family he's built over decades, or future stay in France, build something new with Laurent and Isabelle. And there's no right answer. There's just the choice, and the living with it. Here's what I want to ask you. What would you choose? If you were Daryl, caught between two families, two worlds, two versions of yourself, what would you choose? The familiar or the new? The past or the future? The people who know your history or the people who just know you? And would your choice be about what's best for you or what's best for the people you're choosing? Because that's Daryl's dilemma. Daryl's not choosing based on what he wants. Daryl's choosing based on who needs him more. And that's the problem. Because Daryl's making it about utility again, about where he's most needed, most valuable, most useful. And the real growth would be Daryl choosing based on where he wants to be, where Daryl, the person, not the protector, would be happiest. But that requires Daryl believing his happiness matters. And I'm not sure Daryl believes that yet. Maybe Daryl's dark truth isn't that he's broken. Maybe it's that he's finally ready to heal, and healing is scarier than surviving. Because surviving is familiar. Surviving is what Daryl knows. But healing requires hope, requires believing that the future can be better than the past, requires choosing to live, not just to not die. And that's terrifying. Because hope can be disappointed, healing can fail. And if Daryl tries to heal and fails, if he chooses connection and loses again, that might break him permanently. So staying broken, staying in survival mode, it's safer. It's known, but it's also killing him. And Daryl's at the point where he has to choose. Stay broken and safe, or risk healing and possibly shattering. And I think, watching Daryl in France, watching him with Laurent and Isabel, I think Daryl's ready to risk it. I think Daryl's ready to choose healing. He's just terrified of what that means, of who he might become if he's not the survivor anymore, of whether people will still love him if he's not useful, and those are fair fears. But they're also fears that will keep Daryl trapped forever if he doesn't face them. And maybe that's what France is. Daryl's chance to face his fears, to choose growth over safety, to become someone new. Or maybe France is just another place Daryl will run from when things get too real, when vulnerability gets too scary. And we won't know until Daryl chooses, until the crossbow finally gets set down, and Daryl's hands do something else, something that isn't about survival, something that's about living.